Hi everyone, welcome to the April 20th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're taking a look back at last weekend's racing, focusing primarily on Oaklawn Park, where they had their two graded stakes races last Saturday, topped by that anticipated matchup in the Grade 1 Apple Blossom between Swiss Skydiver and Monomoy Girl, though there was a spoiler in that race. It was a really exciting one to watch, and we'll recap that along with the Oaklawn Handicap, the other graded stakes race from last Saturday at Oaklawn. Both of those produced some nice performances and some really exciting finishes. Also on Saturday, we saw a pretty fast speed figure out in California and at Santa Anita in the Californian. We'll talk about that and how it impacts the older horse picture. There was also an impressive race on Sunday there, so we'll talk about some of the other action from that California track. Then we'll move on to Keeneland, where they didn't have a ton of graded stakes action last week, but there was an interesting turf marathon, the Elkhorn, and also a bunch of allowance and maiden races that produced some nice speed figures. So we'll talk about those as well before wrapping things up at Aqueduct, where they ran the Woodhaven for the 3-year-olds on turf, a nice returnee there in the 3-year-old division, and also a filly in the 4-year-old division who came back off a long layoff for Chad Brown, who made a nice impression. But Craig, the focus was on Oaklawn Park on Saturday, where that matchup between Swiss Skydiver and Monomoy Girl was obviously highly anticipated, and it produced a really nice race, though. Latruska, she was the spoiler.
Yeah, she was. I mean, I think both of us thought it wasn't a 2-horse race, but the upsetter got up. It was quite an effort by Latruska. I know we've talked about her many times as she runs pretty often, and we've both liked what we've seen from her with those blinkers removed, and it just shows what a difference equipment can make for some of the horses out there. She's just a much more relaxed filly these days, and she looked great doing it. She showed her gameness. I don't think Monomoy Girl lost anything in defeat. I thought she ran great. She was giving up 6 pounds to the winner. She dug in, and it was just a nose at the wire. So it's one of the rare times in racing where all the pre-race hype actually lived up to its billing, though not necessarily with the 2 horses people suspected.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't that surprised that Latruska made it competitive at the end. I was a little surprised that she actually turned away Monomoy Girl in the final 16th, because Monomoy Girl is just known for her will to win races and her grit and gameness, especially in the stretch. Even when it looks like she's struggling, she just seems to always get the job done and find a way to get her nose on the wire first. So it was a little surprising to see Latruska actually outduel her to the finish, and especially when she was down about a neck at the 16th pole and came back. So really impressive from Latruska. Irad Ortiz, I mean, he rode her with a ton of confidence. I saw some people criticizing the ride of Florent Giroux. I didn't get that at all. I thought he did everything right. He challenged Latruska when he really needed to at the quarter pole, got Monomoy Girl's head in front, and she was just second best on the day. You could say that weight maybe had something to do with it, because Monomoy Girl was carrying 6 more pounds than Latruska. I think when the difference between the two is just basically a couple of inches, 6 pounds can make a difference. But I mean, that's the way that the weights worked out for the race. I'm sure if it's a handicap next time, they'll be much closer. But Latruska, take nothing away from her. She was just the right horse on the day. Swiss Skydiver, she was the disappointment in the race. I think if you're going to criticize any ride in this race, maybe you would the ride of Robbie Alvarado, who just seemed a little indecisive in the opening stages of the race, like he was going to force the pace a little bit and then backed off. But at the end of the day, she was just not competitive with the top 2.
No, I would definitely agree with that. I wasn't a fan of that ride at all from Robbie Alvarado, especially when you look at the pace figures. This race, I haven't mentioned the speed figures. Latruska got a 123, I believe it was. A little bit of a pace upgrade of 3 or 4 points because of that slow pace that was set. And I just didn't get kind of coming out of the gate, establishing a clear lead and then giving it up for no reason because they weren't going very fast. So that one was a little puzzling to me. I'd still also question the decision not to use Lasix here. Well, we'll never really know if it was a factor or not, but I don't think it can hurt. And in $1 million race, I don't think I would have passed up using Lasix for an extra $60,000 if the horse actually won the race.
Yeah, I kind of understood what Robbie Alvarado was trying to do, because I went back and watched the Preakness again, and he was trying to give her the exact same ride that he did in the Preakness, I suppose, because she broke really sharply in that race, and then he just slotted in on the inside, stalking in about 3rd or 4th behind the leaders that day, and he was able to make that that well-documented backstretch move to take the lead and put her head in front of Authentic coming around the far turn. But that was a situation that rarely presents itself where you have that opportunity to make that mid-race move. And he stuck her inside of Latruska, and she was racing about 3/4 of a length back on the rail the entire way. And usually that's just an uncomfortable position for horses to race in. I wouldn't willingly put a horse in that spot. So I just thought it was the wrong decision because she's not the kind of horse that needs a specific sort of ride. She could have been on the lead. She could have been off the pace. She could have come 3 wide. She's done it all in the past. So I'm not sure why you'd go for that most risky kind of trip like she got in the Preakness. But I don't think it really mattered at the end of the day. I'm not sure why she didn't show up here. As we noted on the forecast, she ran off Lasix in the Beholder last time, and her speed figure regressed from that race. So I'm not sure that Lasix really had anything to do with it. She just wasn't really up to it this day, and the top 2 were superior to her. But I'll be really interested to see how these horses come back out of this race, and I hope we get to see some more matchups between these horses, or hopefully even with all 3 of them before the Breeders' Cup in the fall, because it's nice to see these horses have some rivalries and race against each other more than just once on the year.
Yeah, and I'd throw in She Dares the Devil as well, who beat Latruska last time out. Add her into the mix. And there's some nice fillies and mares out there running top speed figures.
Now, we talked a little bit about the pace of the Apple Blossom and how it was a little bit slower, maybe not than expected, but certainly slower than the Oaklawn Handicap, which was run 2 races earlier. Different distance. This one was going 1 1/8 miles, but I mentioned that because we had talked about it on the forecast earlier, that this was a race that did not project to feature much pace. Looked like Warrior's Charge was going to have things all to himself on the front end, but even though it was a losing ride, I want to give a lot of credit to the ride that Juan Hernandez gave Express Train, because he rode a stalker the right way. He came out of the gate with intention, really made Warrior's Charge do some work to get to the front end and kind of ensure that that one would have a tougher trip than the pace projector anticipated. And it didn't quite work out for Express Train because the race did fall apart a little bit at the end, but I thought he gave that horse a great ride, though arguably the horse that got the best trip was Ricardo Santana and Silver State, who got the pace that he needed, was able to work out that inside-out trip, and he just ran them all down to get his 5th consecutive victory.
Yeah, I guess at this point, I have to say I've been underrating Silver State a bit. He was able to win the race, got a 1:22 TimeformUS speed figure. I do agree he got the best trip, but maybe he's just a horse who makes his own trip, and he certainly has a nose for the wire. So I'm going to have to be careful being so optimistic betting against this guy, because he just seems to keep getting the job done. That said, I thought the 2-3 finishers also ran really well. Fearless was pretty close to that early pace. He got a similar 1:22 speed figure, as did Express Train, who was also tracking that fast pace. And then we had Warrior's Charge. We had Owendale back and forth, who ran his usual 1:20 speed figure like clockwork. He's always within a point or 2 of that. So while he doesn't win very often, he has a fan in me, as he makes speed figure making really easy, because he's just so consistent. We love horses like this when we make speed figures.
Yeah, I would say, and I'm not just asserting this because I picked the horse, but I think if you reversed the trips of Silver State and Fearless, you probably would have had a different result in this race, because Irad Ortiz, he was trying to give Fearless the right ride. He's a horse that can get a little sluggish sometimes early in his races, and he was really intent on making sure that this horse was in the game early, which is what you wanted to do given the way the race was supposed to shake out from a pace standpoint, because as I said, there wasn't a whole lot of speed signed on paper, but they ended up going a little faster than I think anybody anticipated in the early stages of this race. So while he had Fearless close to the pace, I think it ended up backfiring a little bit, because they started to tire, the leaders did, coming around the far turn, and Fearless wound up in the pocket there, and he lost some momentum. And even though he had about 3 or 4 lengths on Silver State leaving the backstretch, by the time they got to the top of the stretch, Silver State had passed him and had gained a lot of momentum, whereas Fearless was back on the rail trying to come up the inside of some tiring runners, which is just never where you want to be, especially in a dirt race. So I thought Fearless ran really well to just lose by half a length, and I think if he had gotten that kind of outside run in the clear, where he had been able to build momentum throughout the race, I think he probably would have won here, but he still ran really well in defeat and got a solid 1:22 TimeformUS speed figure. All 3 of the top 3 finishers actually got the same 1:22, and that's a solid number for a grade 2 race.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's about par for grade two. They were pretty bunched up on the figures. I think it's the top six horses or five horses all got one. I think it's six all got 120 or above. So pretty strong race for the class. It'll be interesting. Still waiting for some horses to step up. We're gonna talk about a race elsewhere where they did, but it's a decent effort from an older horse, but still a little bit lacking. Like I wouldn't expect any of these to suddenly become leaders of the division. It's just a good, solid group.
That was all of the notable action at Oaklawn. Let's move on to Santa Anita, where they ran a couple really fast speed figures in the stakes races that we saw on both Saturday and Sunday. Let's begin with the race for older horses on Saturday. That was the Grade 2 Californian going 1.125 miles. And this is one of the highest speed figures that we've seen, well, certainly of the past week in April, but really of the entire year, as Royal Ship and Country Grammar put on a real show going in this 1.125 race, basically hooking up from the start and dueling each other all the way around the track. Royal Ship was able to get up for the victory here, I believe achieving his first dirt victory ever, and Country Grammar making his first start for Bob Baffer. He did not relent willingly. He battled that horse all the way to the wire, and these two earned a really high 131 Timeform US speed figure.
Yeah, these two threw it down right from the gate, and you're exactly right. It was the first win on dirt for Royal Ship. He is by Midshipman, who won I believe it was the Breeders' Cup Juvenile as a 2-year-old before not racing anymore after that due to an injury. So, but other than that, I didn't know a whole lot about his breeding, but him and Country Grammar, it was a match race from the start, and they just went at it, took it to each other, and as soon as the time popped up at the end, I just based on how the Santa Anita surface has been playing for a while, I knew it was going to be a big figure. And it's not like the horse who they left way back in third, Independence Hall, is some slacker. I mean, he's a pretty good horse who consistently runs speed figures in the 120s. He did it here as well. So just a really strong effort from these two. And Country Grammar did it coming off a layoff, first stop in the Bob Baffert barn. So a lot of promise out of these, as I don't know if we know exactly what we have in them, but they certainly had reason to jump up, being first real dirt try he had run back in November for Royal Ship, but the first time he was thrown in against some good horses, and I just really liked what I saw, particularly from the clock.
Yeah, Royal Ship is kind of a funny horse because he had come to hand racing on turf in Brazil. He was actually a Group 1 winner in that country, and understandably, when Richard Mandela got him, he ran him on turf in some graded stakes last year. Just tried the dirt once, I think because he was training so well on the dirt in the Native Diver last year. That was just a 4-horse field, but if you watch the start of that race, Royal Ship got off to as poor a start as you could possibly imagine. I mean, he stumbled, it looked like his head turned sideways, it was just a complete disaster, and he finished last in that race, but he really never had a chance after that start. But he returned as a 5-year-old with a solid effort in that Grade 1 Kilroe Mile, just losing by a length, although he was 5th in there. And they put him back on dirt here, and even though he hasn't had that many chances on the dirt, I think there's an argument based on this race that dirt is his preferred surface, and I hope they keep him on dirt from here on out, because he took to this surface, loved the distance. Country Grammar was running a big race. It looked like he was really comfortable on the front end, and he looked strong coming off the turn, and Royal Ship just ran him down. Really game efforts from both of these horses. Independence Hall, it looked like early in the race he was getting the perfect trip for him, but he just couldn't go with these top two. Just really nice efforts for these, and I'll be interested to see how they stack up against some of the more recognizable names in this older horse division moving forward, because they're among the fastest out there based on this race.
Yeah, and I was kind of tripping over my tongue with the first dirt. I was considering the trip he had last time. I had pretty much put a line through that one. So it was his first real dirt start in North America based on that. I will say he came back this year as a first-time gelding, and maybe that's made a difference with him. But we're certainly going to get to see him race, so he's not going to be hustled off to any breeding shed or anything. So sky's the limit for this guy, and I'm really looking forward to seeing both of them come back, because it was fast and they look good doing it.
Yeah, and Country Grammar might go down as one of the steals of the year, being purchased for just $110,000 out of that Paul Pompa dispersal earlier this year. He had shown real talent last year when in the Chad Brown barn, winning the Peter Pan, and not running that badly in the Travers. I think he was 5th or 6th in that race, but he's obviously stepped forward under Bob Baffert's care and now is a 4-year-old. So a lot to look forward to from these two horses. Just a real eye-opening effort from these two. So we'll be interested to see what they do in the future. We saw another fast speed figure on Sunday at Santa Anita in the Grade 3 Kona Gold. This time, the Bob Baffert runner got it done as Cezanne, coming off the long layoff, won, turning him all the way back to 6.5 furlongs. This horse certainly got a ton of pace ahead of him, but boy, did he finish once he got into the stretch.
Yeah, he did. I don't have the official speed figure yet, but I think my partner says it's going to be around a 125 for the spot. So career best for Cezanne. Not a big surprise in his first start as a 4-year-old, but he certainly backed up a lot of that promise we saw him show as a 3-year-old, where he was actually being talked about as a Kentucky Derby favorite for a while. I will say he certainly got a beneficial setup. It looks like his stablemate Axeman was entered strictly to harass the heavy favorite Brickyard Ride, and he did harass him into going a bit too fast. But in the end, Cezanne won so easily, I'm not sure it made much of a difference. He was able to just sit on the rail, blow by, and won easily. So impressive return effort. I would assume they're going to want to stretch this one back out. He's won at 2 turns before, and maybe there shouldn't really be any question on distance based on his breeding. So I would imagine he has some pretty big targets, and that might include the horses we saw in the Californian as future rivals.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see what they decide to do with this horse, because even though he won going shorter here, he's always been one that they've talked about wanting to stretch out. His pedigree certainly says he should want to go longer, being by Keeneland. He's got a stamina-oriented female family if you go a little deeper into the second generation, although his one best sibling was a sprinter, but that one was not by Keeneland. So I'll be interested to see what they decide to do with Cezanne. He's clearly very lightly raced. This was just the 4th start of his career, and it's kind of funny. He's coming out of that shared belief stakes from Del Mar last summer, and we had talked at the time about how that was a 4-horse field where it felt like the speed figure came back surprisingly fast. It seemed inconceivable that all 4 horses would have improved so much, but that's been a number that's kind of held up over time, and Cezanne is just the latest one to run back to that number, actually improving upon it, I would assume, in this Kona Gold, if he does indeed get a number in the mid-120s here. So a really impressive performance from him, and I'm excited to see what he does in the future. I did have a question about the fractions of this race. I know that there have been some issues with the timing of the 6.5 and 7 furlong races at Santa Anita. That opening quarter of 21 flat seems inconceivable to me. I know Brickyard Ride's a fast horse. That seems kind of insanely fast, even for him. But it did look like they were really moving up front, because Cezanne definitely got some pace to close into.
Well, I'll have to go check that out. It's something that they did get remedied, and there hadn't been problems for a while, so I didn't give it a second thought. But since you bring it up, I'll give it a check and report back to you.
I know that 6.5 furlong races can sometimes produce some wacky fractions because a lot of tracks run 6.5 furlongs with a long run up. So maybe that's the reasoning there why that occurred. I haven't looked at the other 6.5 furlong races. Maybe they all have a fast opening quarter mile. I was just kind of wondering about that because you rarely see those kind of fractions at Santa Anita these days. But that is a very fast horse. He just got run off. He just got engaged in an early duel and couldn't see out the 6.5 furlongs here. Moving on to the other graded stakes that they ran at Santa Anita last week, stretching out from 6.5 furlongs in the Kona Gold. This one was 1.5 miles. That was the Tokyo City Cup run on the main track. And Tis a Magician, a horse who had tried this distance once before, stretched back out to it here and clearly relished the marathon trip, whereas some others probably didn't. He was facing a field of primarily turf horses or dirt runners that hadn't really shown the proficiency to go this far in the past. But Tis a Magician, as a 4-year-old, seems like he's taken a step forward, and this was a nice performance from him.
It was. Being a Sunday race, don't have the speed figure just yet, but I would guess it's going to be in the 123 range. He certainly won easy enough in here. I'm not sure how much relevance it'll have going forward. We don't have a lot of 1.5 mile races in this country. The time you mentioned before that Tis a Magician had run was in this very same race last year, the Tokyo City Cup. I think it was delayed a bit, run later in the year last year, but no reason to think he can't continue to run 120 plus speed figures anywhere from that 1.8 miles to 1.5 miles range. So he's a horse who's going to win some races. He's definitely got some talent.
Yeah, and in this dirt marathon division, if you're running numbers in the low 120s, that's going to be good enough to win a lot of the races that we see in this division in 2021, because you typically get a lot of horses that are running a little bit slower to win these races. So it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do with Tis Magician. I know he's coming from a barn that doesn't often ship to other jurisdictions outside of California, but he certainly would be a major player in that division if they decide to run in those races in the future. One more race to discuss from Santa Anita last week. That was a Saturday allowance race won by the returning CC, who was making her 5-year-old debut here. This Mike McCarthy trainee. She had done some nice things last year. She was actually the winner of the Grade 1 Apple Blossom back in 2020. Kind of ended the year on a sour note, struggling to be competitive in some Grade 1 races. But they gave her a confidence booster, dropping her back down into allowance company here, and she responded with a nice victory.
Yeah, this was one looked a little tricky on the speed figures. I wasn't sure what my assistant would do here, but it was a pretty slow race. There's no other way to sugarcoat it. It came back only a 107 TimeformUS speed figure, but I'm not really sure. I'm not going to knock CC too much for that. She basically had this field over a barrel. Once the Bob Baffert trained Happier really just didn't show up. She was the only one even in the same area code as far as speed figures go. So CC just sat toward the back of the pack, was able to work out a trip, shoot up the rail, and she looked like one who's back in good form. I'm not going to hold the speed figure against her. I would expect her to run much faster in a tougher spot next time. So good return effort from her. I doubt we'll see her sprinting. I think she's one who probably wants 2 turns more than one. She did run in the, one of the Derby City on Derby Day. She ran in the sprint
behind Serengeti Empress and Bell's the
right.
Run.
But that didn't go very well, so against much better competition. So I think they want to get her back out to 2 turns.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I hear what you're getting at. Cece's kind of in a tough spot because, I mean, while she showed a lot of ability early in her 4-year-old season, she was never running the kind of speed figures that we've seen out of horses like now Latruska and Monomoy Girl and even Swiss Skydiver when she's at her best, and turning her back to sprints means she would have to face Gamine. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with what to do with her. They could try sprinting more, they could try to stretch out, but she's probably going to be a little overmatched in both of those divisions. So maybe they can find some grade 2s and grade 3s for her, but I wonder if she can really still be competitive in those grade 1 races.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. I don't know what they would do with her. I think she's better around 2 turns. They run plenty of the races out in California, so maybe she'll just stay there and hope Swiss Skydiver doesn't come back. She tends to ship all over the place and seems to run fine everywhere, so she'd probably be the main foe. I don't think she'd have to deal with any of the other ones you talked about.
Let's move on to Keeneland, where they just ran a couple of graded stakes last week, but there were also some intriguing allowance races that we wanted to mention. Let's begin with those graded stakes, though, beginning with the Grade 2 Elkhorn, run at 1.5 miles on Saturday. That was won by the California shipper Say the Word. This is a horse who had shown some real improvement when they moved to Phil D'Amato's barn at the end of last year, and he took that California form to Keeneland with no problem, got the job done in a race that was kind of oddly run from a pace standpoint, and there were certainly some trips in behind the winner.
Yeah, there were, and the results behind the winner, who was completely logical. I think he wound up going off the second choice in here. But when you look at the next 3, it's kind of odd to see because it's not a lot of horses that made sense or that we talked about on the forecast. But I think trips were definitely involved in that. Say the Word, though, got a great trip, ran a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, and kind of backed up that California form that he's been showing since he moved there for Phil D'Amato. So good effort from him. It was a pretty odd betting race as well. I thought I was really surprised a horse like Tide of the Sea, who was coming out of those kind of weak Gulfstream races we had talked about, was actually bet down the favoritism. I think he wound up way near the back of the pack as part of a pretty fast pace set by him and another long shot. So interesting race, good effort from Say the Word with that 123. Good to see Channel Cat, who actually wound up finishing second, kind of get back into good form. I thought he got a great trip from Corey Lannery in there to get the place position. So outside those, the top 2, I think there are a lot of excuses.
Yeah, it's kind of funny as you see how Epic Bromance and Tide of the Sea fared in this race, how different that Keeneland turf course is, especially when it gets some give in it, how different it is than the Gulfstream Park turf course when it's rock hard, because both Epic Bromance and Tide of the Sea have done really well setting paces or contesting the pace on the front end at Gulfstream, and they just did not have the stamina to win this Elkhorn, setting legitimate fractions on the front end, and the pace completely fell apart. I've got to say, I questioned some of the rides in this race. I mean, Tyler Gaffleone tried to be aggressive on Tide of the Sea in the early going, but I'm not sure that you really benefit from going after a hopeless long shot like Epic Bromance. When that horse wants to run off, you just kind of have to let him go and run second and lead the rest of the field and let him come back to you as he was expected to do. And going after him kind of took away any chance Tide of the Sea had of winning this race. As for the closers, I mean, there were also some trips among those horses. I mean, Red Knight was just kind of wide the entire way. He didn't really show up anyway, but he was just kind of out there in no man's land for his entire trip. And North Dakota, I'm not really sure what John Velasquez was doing with him, kind of trying to follow some tiring horses that figured to stop coming around the far turn and kind of rode that horse directly into traffic when it looked like there were so many other available paths. That kind of took away any chance he had of making up ground in the stretch. And that created the situation that you talked about where some horses that didn't seem that logical basically rounded out the entire superfecta behind Say the Word. Channel Cat, he ran well. He's a horse that we've seen to be competitive in these races in the past. He was previously in Todd Pletcher's bar. Now he's with Jack Sisterson. So a nice runner-up finish from him. But I agree with you. Say the Word. He was just logical, and he was simply the best horse in this race. Moving on to the other graded stakes that we saw at Keeneland last week. That was the Double Dog Dare Grade 3 event on Friday for the fillies and mares going a mile and a 16th. And this was a really exciting race to watch. Basically a 3-horse battle all the way down to the line. And it was the grinder, Bonnie South, who got the money between horses, battling back as Graceful Princess was trying to come back at her on the rail and Royal Flag was running at her at the outside. Bonnie South was able to hold both of those runners at bay.
Yeah, she was at a distance. It's probably not even ideal for her. I would think a mile and a 16th is a little bit on the short side. But watching the race, I thought maybe this was going to be a really nice race speed figure-wise. But when the numbers came back, it wasn't. The top 3 all wound up with 112s. Maybe I can give Bonnie South a bit of an excuse because, as I said, I don't really think this is her best distance. But kind of a weak race for a grade 3 at Keeneland. I usually expect a little bit better from this, and all the top 3 in here would have a long gap to make up to a race like the Apple Blossom, which is to be expected. A grade 3 to a grade 1 is a pretty big jump, but some of these I think probably have aspirations to race in higher classes, and I just didn't see it here.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you've got a race like this that features a relatively slow pace, it's always tough to get a higher speed figure. We saw a very similar scenario with Molifat in the Ashland when she was a real visually impressive winner, but she did her running basically at the end of a moderately paced race, and she got a lower speed figure as well. So I think when you've got this mile and a 16th distance at Keeneland and you've got a horse that's a little bit overmatched setting a moderate pace, it's tough for horses that come from the back of the pack like Bonnie South and Royal Flag to achieve higher speed figures. And watching this race, I mean, when you've got a horse like Graceful Princess involved in the finish, I mean, that was kind of a tip-off to me that this was probably a pretty slow race because Graceful Princess, even though she's out of Havre de Grace, who was one of the best fillies and mares of the past couple of decades, she hasn't shown that kind of ability on the racetrack as a daughter of that horse, so a little surprising to see her involved in the finish here. Royal Flag and Bonnie South, they're solid enough runners, but I never really expected them to ascend to be competitive in grade 1 races this year, so maybe they'll run a little bit faster in the future, especially stretching out to a mile and an eighth, but I think this is probably what they are, kind of grade 3 level runners.
Yeah, and the real disappointment in here was Speech, who I think went off the favorite, and something clearly went wrong with her. She was basically eased, so hopefully everything's okay, because she was really a top 3-year-old filly for a while. She actually won the Ashland last year really easily over Bonnie South, so hopefully things are okay with her and she gets back on track.
Yeah, and as we have this Lasix debate, I mean, I don't know if Speech bled. I saw no reporting on this. She certainly ran like a horse that bled. Sometimes you don't always see that epistaxis situation where they're actually bleeding from the nostrils, which the chart callers will often note in the charts for the race. So I'm not sure. I didn't see any reporting on that, but I mean, it would be logical if that was what happened. it didn't seem like there was some kind of bone issue or other kind of injury that would have caused her to run poorly because she walked across the wire at the end. Yeah, when we talk about horses not running well or not running up to what they can previously do with Lasix, I think of performances like this, where horse just completely doesn't show up. If we were just looking at this weekend's races and talked about horses that didn't run on Lasix, I think generally we'd see horses actually improving off Lasix, especially when you take the California races into account that we saw this weekend. All of those were without Lasix, and we saw some horses running gigantic speed figures. So across the board, it really is averaging out. And as we talked about on Twitter last week, Craig, I'll be interested to see some more data compiled on this, because I think you really do have to look at these races being run this year without Lasix to see the horses that previously raced on it, and then those same horses coming off it. That's how you see the effect of Lasix, and I'd love to see plenty of data on that. But from my perspective, I think it's not much of a factor, except when you get a horse like maybe Speech who bled in here, although I don't know if that's the case. It just seems like that might be the logical explanation.
Yeah, it certainly looked like it. I imagine we'll get some reporting if that happened at some point. But yeah, it's a tough spot for bettors. I mean, this is a horse that went off the favorite in here, and if she did indeed bleed, you have to wonder, is it going to be reported that she did or she didn't, and how's that going to affect the future races when she runs? So it's kind of a tough spot for bettors to be in. I completely understand the reason for racing wanting to get out of the Lasix game. I don't know if it's probably the most important issue that should have been tackled, but I'm okay with it. As you said, the vast majority of horses run just fine without Lasix, so if it goes away, fine. But it is going to be some tough spots for bettors between now and when this finally gets resolved.
Yeah, and whether or not horses run faster with or without Lasix, I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have from a handicapping standpoint for these next couple of years as it's being phased out. But I mean, eventually the point is going to become moot if all horses are running without Lasix. It doesn't really matter if they run faster with or without it. If you decide not to use it, then everyone's on an even playing field. So I'll look forward to that point in time. But for now, it will be interesting to get some data on how that affects horses, just from a handicapping standpoint, because you want to know those little things, they do make a difference.
Yeah, and it's tricky for us speed figure makers because these races are being run on cards where some of the races the horses can use Lasix, and in fact most of the horses are using Lasix. So in a case like this race that comes back slow, sometimes I wonder, is it because they didn't have Lasix? But then other times we see races where not. So it's just going to take a while to build up some data, and you're really going to have to be careful with that data because you have to keep in mind the way speed figures are being made now, and if you're taking that into account. Personally, I'm not taking it into account, so I know that when I sit down and we have enough data to study it, how to factor that in and not overdo it. But it's really a tricky situation for speed figures and bettors alike, as well as owners who have horses that do bleed when they don't get Lasix. So interesting times in racing. I'm looking forward to the day that it's gone, just because I think it'll make things a lot easier for everybody.
Yeah, I am too. I was never really somebody who was pro or anti-Lasix before, but as it's kind of been phased out a little bit, and you've seen some horsemen and some people who are proponents of Lasix make the argument for it, it's kind of made me more anti-Lasix as I hear some of those what sound to me like thin arguments for having Lasix when the rest of the world is able to operate without it. It's not like the United States and North America is on a different planet. I mean, they're the same breed, the same horses, and if the rest of the world can do without it, I think the United States can too. So we'll see how that develops over the next few years, and I'm interested to hear how it turns out from a handicapping standpoint. But like you, I'll be interested and grateful when it's gone. Let's move on to some non-Lasix races as we move away from the stakes action into some allowance company that took place at Keeneland last week. Also on the Saturday card, we saw an allowance race going 1 mile and a 16th. That was won by South Bend, who was making his first start as a 4-year-old. This is a runner who, as a 3-year-old last year, competed in races like the Travers and the Kentucky Derby. Didn't do so well in the latter of those two races, but making his first start off the long layoff year, he got the job done on a pretty exciting race. It was really competitive at the top of the stretch, and South Bend made that late run under who else? Joel Rosario to get up and win.
Yeah, I thought this was a nice effort from South Bend. He's a horse we talked about many times last year because he ran so often, and I think both of us had thought that he was going to be a better horse on the dirt than he was on turf, where he had kind of got pigeonholed for a little while, and he was thrown to the wolves a bit, obviously, in the Kentucky Derby. I don't think that he's that kind of horse, but this was a really nice return. He got a 114 speed figure. He did it coming from off the pace in a race that just had a moderate pace at best. So I really like the way he was able to finish it off. The leader, who was coincidentally the winner of the Queen's Plate, I believe, last year, Mighty Heart, set a pace on a clear lead with speed figure or pace figures of only 110 early, and South Bend was able to finish up this race at a 114. So he was really finishing it off, and look forward to seeing what else he can do.
Yeah, it was a really exciting race to watch. I mean, Mighty Hart, he put in a really game effort. Nice to see him rebound. Empty Tomb, who was second here, he was a bit of a long shot in this race, but he still ran well to be second. Some others were in the mix at the top of the stretch before South Bend asserted himself in the late stages. South Bend seems like a horse that can handle longer distances. I mean, he obviously ran pretty well in the Travers last year behind Tis the Law, going 1.25 miles. So he's going to have to run faster to be competitive against Graded Stakes Company, but I just thought it was a nice starting point for that winner. Moving on to some allowance races from Friday, where there were a few notable speed figures, or one notable speed figure, moving a little ahead in my mind to Thursday, where there were three we're going to talk about. But on Friday's card at Keeneland, we saw a 1.125 mile race that was won by the Chad Brown-trained Masterpiece. This is a horse who had just made one prior start in the United States that was in an ambitious spot in the Turf Classic last year against Grade 1 Company, but he got some class relief here in his 5-year-old debut and put in a nice late run to get the job done.
Yeah, this was a good effort from him. He got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. He had actually run pretty good, I thought, in that race where he ran in last year in the stakes race. He got a nice figure that day, a 126, pressing what was a pretty fast pace in a race won by Channel Maker, who wound up being the Eclipse Award winner. So promising horse for Chad Brown. I know a lot of people were disappointed in his results last year. Not that they were bad by any stretch. I mean, most trainers would love to have what Chad Brown had, but it was a bit of a letdown from the prior year. But he seems to be restocked this year and has been sending out a lot of bullets since racing moved to Keeneland and Aqueduct, and looking like the barn is pretty stout this year.
Yeah, it feels like we've been talking about a lot of allowance winners from this Chad Brown barn in the last few Pacecasts, whether they be on turf, where most of them have taken place, or even on dirt. We're going to get to one at Aqueduct that was pretty impressive on the main track. So it seems like he is pretty stocked for the upcoming stakes races around the country. And this horse, Masterpiece, I wouldn't be surprised to see them take a shot in a race like the Manhattan next on Belmont Day. They obviously tried that Grade 1 last year and didn't quite work out, going 1.5 miles. Maybe 1.25 miles is going to be a little better for this horse, because he certainly put in a nice late run to get the job done here. He's not one that appears to have a really explosive turn of foot, but he keeps coming at you, and it seemed like he was really hitting his best stride when they crossed the wire here, going 1.125 miles. And the horse that was second in this spot, Admiralty Pier, I mean, he's not always winning graded stakes, but he's often right there in a lot of them, competing up in Canada or even in the US. So he was beating a good horse here, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him to ascend to Grade 1 Cup in the next few starts.
Yeah, and Bando, who finished third, has had his share of successes in stakes races as well. So really solid allowance field. Not a surprise at Keeneland. I mean, this could have been a stakes race in a lot of places. So good return for him, and looking forward to seeing him where he shows up next.
Let's move ahead to Thursday's card at Keeneland, which I was moving ahead to a little early, just a few minutes ago, where we saw three pretty notable speed figures in allowance races. The first of those we're going to talk about was the fifth race on that Thursday card. It was 1.16 mile allowance race for the older runners on the turf. This one was won by the Joe Sharp-trained Midnight Tea Time, a horse that doesn't win that often, but he typically runs some nice speed figures, and he was able to get the job done here over Bye Bye Melvin, who I thought ran really well in defeat, making his 4-year-old debut for Graham Motion.
Yeah, I thought both of those two ran well. Midnight Tea Time got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, which is pretty much right in his wheelhouse. He runs similar all the time. And Bye Bye Melvin actually got a 122, pressing a pretty quick pace from the far outside post. He was kind of caught wide around the first turn, and kind of looked like a winner until a few jumps from the wire. So I think both of these two look good, but I actually prefer Bye Bye Melvin, as I get the impression you did as well watching the race.
Yeah, this is one where Chad Brown actually wasn't able to dominate, even though he had the favorite in this race in Gray's Creek. And when I was watching this race, I kind of couldn't believe that Gray's Creek finished off the board, because you typically expect these Chad Brown runners to have that explosive finish. And Tyler Gaffalione put Gray's Creek in position to take this race over at the 8th pole, but he just couldn't go on as Bye Bye Melvin refused to quit, battling back on the inside, and Midnight Tea Time was able to get past him in the late stages. Midnight Tea Time is a horse that needs things to go right to win races, but he's been competitive in stakes in the past, and he's definitely got some ability. But like you, I think Bye Bye Melvin is the horse you want to follow out of this race, because he had shown some potential against Stakes Company last year, and it seems, based on this 4-year-old debut, like he's really taken a step forward, as horses are accustomed to doing when they turn 4 years old.
Yeah, I was going to say Gray's Creek was the disappointment. I think I had actually picked him on the forecast last time out in the Tampa Bay Stakes, and I kind of wrote him off after that day. So I was actually surprised he was favored in here. I thought Bye Bye Melvin is the better horse, and he proved it this day. He just wasn't able to get the win, largely due to trips, I think. But solid effort from him, and another that I think is going to jump back in the stakes right away off this.
Another turf allowance on Thursday that produced a notable speed figure was the 7th race. This one was just going 5.5 furlongs, won by the Wesley Ward trained Maven. And Wesley Ward has had a lot of success at this Keeneland meet, and he brought Maven back off the layoff here for his 4-year-old debut, and it was a good one. This horse is really fast when he's right, and he was right on this day, as he beat the Steve Asmussen trained Boldor, who was kind of funny to see him running in this race on the turf, because he's had his recent success on the dirt. But these two put on a decent show. Another turf allowance that achieved a notable speed figure on that Thursday card was the 7th race, this one going just 5.5 furlongs, as the Wesley Ward trained Maven made his return from a layoff, his 4-year-old debut, and he ran a good one to win this race. This horse is really fast when he's right, and Wesley Ward, who's been sending out a lot of winners lately at Keeneland, he certainly had him right for this return on Thursday, as he ran Boldor, who had been running on dirt recently, off his feet, leading the entire way.
Yeah, this was a good effort for Maven. Came out first time as a gelding off some disappointing efforts last year. Had actually won a stakes, or won an allowance race at Keeneland last year. I think he had won a stakes race over in France, a Group 3 race. But he kind of disappointed the last couple times out, so I assume that's why he was gelded. But man, this was quite the good effort in here, as a 118 sprint figure. Will win a whole lot of sprint races on the turf. Sprint stakes races. So who knows with Wesley Ward where he's going to show up next, or when, but when he does, he's certainly going to be dangerous.
Yeah, I thought it was a really nice effort. This horse is so fast out of the gate when he runs well, and he broke like a shot here and just basically ran the entire race on the lead, up by a couple of lengths. I thought Boldor ran pretty well to be second here. I was kind of surprised to see Asmussen move him right back to the turf, given how well he had run on dirt over the winter at Oaklawn. But it seems like he handles both surfaces equally well, because he gave Maven a brief challenge in upper stretch, was turned away by that horse, but I thought he stayed on well for second here, and it just seems like a useful horse that can run on any surface. The final allowance race we want to discuss at Keeneland on Thursday was one for the 3-year-old fillies. This was won by the Brad Cox trained Inject, a horse that I remember we had talked about on the Pacecast going all the way back to last summer, when she was trained by, I believe, Stanley Huff, and she made her debut, a winning one at Ellis Park. Looked like a horse that was certainly bound for stakes success. Not sure what happened after that. She was disappointed in a lot of races along the way, but seems like she's getting back to top form now, because this was a nice allowance victory.
Yeah, it was. She kind of finally backed up that debut at Ellis Park. Her first start in the Brad Cox barn, she had been in a race where there was very little pace, kind of held the speed figure back. Then she was put on turf where she ran okay. But both of those had low 90-ish speed figures, where here she exploded to a 109 TimeformUS number. So really good race for her, and I assume they're going to keep her at sprint distances. Don't see any kind of stretch out ability here. But for a 3-year-old filly, a 109 is a nice figure, and I certainly think stakes are in her future if she can keep up this form.
Yeah, I thought this was just a surprisingly fast race for these horses. The runner-up, Mistral, she also ran really well for Ian Wilkes. So she's a little more lightly raced than Inject, but she had looked good in her maiden victory in her prior start, and she put in a really game effort here, battling back on the inside. She was the favorite in this race, actually, but Inject was just relentless coming after her on the outside, and they put on a nice show to the wire, and Inject just got up to beat her. I would imagine these two could both step up into stakes company based on this kind of performance, because we've been talking about this three-year-old division throughout the year. We haven't been seeing that many fast speed figures, so a number like 109 could certainly make these horses competitive against stakes company if they continue progressing. And it's funny with Inject, even though she's by Frosted, who was a versatile horse himself, had a lot of speed, get the win going longer, she's that half-sister to Taprit, who won the Belmont Stakes, and it's just kind of funny given that stamina-oriented pedigree that she just seems like one that she really wants to sprint.
Yeah, she does. And even the third place finisher in here, Our Working Girl, another Wesley Ward horse, got a 108 speed figure for setting a pretty quick pace. And in the end, she was only beaten a couple lengths as well. So while not on the level of the other two, still thought she ran a pretty good race.
One more race to mention from Keeneland last week, and this one did not achieve the kind of fast speed figure that we usually talk about on this Pacecast, but I'll allow these horses some leeway because they're just 2-year-olds, and we've been watching a lot of these 2-year-old 4.5 furlong races at Keeneland over the past few weeks, and I think this is one of the fastest ones that we've seen. The race that was run on Wednesday, race 4 on that card for the Colts and Geldings, and Nakatomi was able to beat, I believe, his filly stablemate Happy Soul. Both of these runners were from the Wesley Ward barn, and they put on quite a show, drawing about a dozen lengths clear of the rest of the field. And these seem like two of the best Wesley Ward 2-year-olds that he's unveiled at the Keeneland meet.
Yeah, he hasn't been winning the races at the rate he usually does, but he still had a few wins, and this was probably the best one. Got an 89 TimeformUS speed figure. These are tough speed figures to make. I know the buyer team, I don't even think they make speed figures for them because they're run on a different part of the track that isn't used very often. So kind of take them with that and, with a grain of salt. Not saying there isn't a lot of work put into them, because we did do that to kind of come up with where we're comfortable making them. And I think the figures we've made have held up pretty well. But what I liked in this case was he was off the pace a little bit, and the way he finished the race was good. He actually was speeding up at the end. The quarter-mile pace figure was just an 82. He got a final time figure of 90. So that's kind of what I look for in these races, because let's face it, they're not going to run 4.5 furlong races for very long, if at all, ever again. So I want to see who's finishing and who looks like they can get more distance. And that would be Nakatomi in here as opposed to the runner-up.
Yeah, and I know Wesley Ward is always looking for those horses that can transfer their form to turf that he can take over to Royal Ascot. I'm not sure if either of these runners fit the bill. Nakatomi's by Firing Line, who is a sire who just generally hasn't had much success, but certainly not as a turf sire. So I wonder what we'll see from them. But Wesley certainly got horses with not a lot of turf pedigree to be successful at Ascot in the past. So you never know what he's going to take over there and how he's going to do. He always has a shot. Let's finish up this podcast by moving to Aqueduct, just to discuss a couple more races. One of those was the stakes race feature from Saturday at Aqueduct. That was the listed Woodhaven Stakes for 3-year-olds, going 1.16 miles on the turf. And Hard Love from the Jonathan Thomas barn is a horse who had shown some real promise last year, racing as a 2-year-old, winning his maiden with a nice speed figure in his debut, then finishing second to the highly regarded Never Surprised in his second start at Aqueduct in the fall. And while he ran the lowest speed figure of his career, coming off the layoff in the Woodhaven, I thought it was a decent return for a horse that probably has his sights set on bigger things in the future.
Yeah, Hard Love. I was glad to see him come back in good form and get back to the winner's circle. He only got a 104 TimeformUS speed figure for the win here, which isn't quite what he ran to last year. But on turf, a lot of times that's dictated by who you're in against. He ran just fine for me, and I would expect him to get back to those numbers or better that we saw as a 2-year-old.
Yeah, he strikes me as a horse that's not going to mind a little added ground. So I think if they target races like the Belmont Derby or the Saratoga Derby later in the year, both of those are going, I think, 1.25 and 1.316 respectively. He seems like the kind of horse that could handle those distances as a son of Kitten's Joy. So I'll be interested to see if he can get back to those numbers he ran as a 2-year-old, because last year he was running some of the fastest numbers we saw on turf from any horse in that 2-year-old division, including numbers faster than the Breeders' Cup winner Fire at Will. So I'll certainly be interested to see if he can get back to those numbers and step forward off this race, which his connections admitted was just a prep for things to come.
Yeah, and a lot of times the competition has a lot to do with the speed figure on turf. I mean, they're not trying to win these races by 10 lengths, so he just sat off, did what he had to do, and like I said, as I mentioned, I would expect better from him next time. Not going to put a lot of stock in that 104.
Let's finish things up on this week's Pacecast with one more race from Aqueduct. That was a Sunday allowance race won by the Chad Brown-trained Althoff. This filly was making her 4-year-old debut. Only saw a couple of appearances from her as a 3-year-old when she ran once on the turf, not doing much in that race, but then switched to the dirt and had a really visually impressive performance at Churchill Downs, coming from way back to win going away. Chad Brown entered her in the Coaching Club American Oaks off that performance at Saratoga last summer. Had to scratch her on the morning of the race, though, and we hadn't seen her for a long time after that, but she made a return at Aqueduct on Sunday, and she was visually impressive once again in victory.
Yeah, she was, not just visually, but numerically. She got a 111 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. I don't think it was particularly the easiest trip. We don't have the fractions coded in blue, but at best it was a moderate piece. It just missed the cutoff for getting blue. She was a few lengths off towards the back of the pack, and I just thought she finished up this race really nicely. So impressive return, and I expect her to be a player in the filly and mare division. Obviously got some pretty big steps to take to get up to the ones we talked about, but she is lightly raced, and I do think there is a promising future with this one because she looks like she can run all day.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. She seems like one that should not mind stretching out in distance beyond this 1 mile. And I know Chad Brown was thinking that last summer by entering her in that 1.125 Coaching Club American Oaks. This was a nice return, and Irad Ortiz rode her with so much confidence. She didn't get a ton of pace to close into, but she just seamlessly moved into the race and just kind of chirped at her at the top of the stretch to get past Love and Love, who is a nice New York bred who can run some nice speed figures and be competitive in races at this level. But she put her in her place at the end of this race and was drawing off as they crossed the wire. Definitely looking forward to see what she can do as a 4-year-old. She's going to have to get faster to ascend into graded stakes company, but she seems like one that should be able to do it. Well, that's all the racing to recap on this week's podcast. Plenty to look forward to in the landscape, though, as we wrap things up at some of the tracks that we were talking about. It looks like there's going to be a lot more action to talk about from Oaklawn or Keeneland moving forward, but we're going to have Belmont Park opening up this upcoming weekend. We'll have racing action moving to Churchill Downs for the Kentucky Derby week. So a lot to look forward to on the racing landscape, and I'm sure Craig and I will talk about some of that action on the TimeformUS forecast coming up this Friday. We'll also at some point do a preview of the Kentucky Derby and some of those contenders. I know the TimeformUS Derby package just became available. The pace projector, Craig and I just retweeted that. It was posted on Twitter the other day. So a lot to talk about on that front as well. So we'll cover all of that on some future podcasts. Remember that you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast on Friday.